Good morning. Welcome and thank you for joining us today in our latest monthly webinar series on pressing educational issues that are top of mind for school administrators. I am Amy Dickerson, and I am joined today by my partners Jennifer Smith and Kendra Yoch. We are members of our firm's Franczek, and particularly members of our firm's special education team here at Franczek. And today we will be focusing on some of the top tips for administrators to keep in mind as you enter the IEP season. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping items that we would like to address. First, right under your presentation slides, you have the ability to type and submit questions. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the program by using this feature. Everyone also that are logged into today's program will receive an email that includes a link to the recording of the webinar as well as the slide deck. With that, we are going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so obviously that is a lighthearted clip, but we thought it does serve as a nice reminder of the importance of these meetings for each and every parent, and the importance for preparing for those meetings to both anticipate any issues that could arise, but also to make sure that you're meeting the parents where they are at, as they may be spending a while preparing for these meetings as well. So with that in mind, we are going to offer today a top 10 list of key things to keep in mind as you enter this busy time and as you prepare for individual meetings. And we'll start with our first reminder, which is to remember that teams can and should pre-meet, pre-plan for your meetings, just making sure that you're not predetermining. It's really important to be prepared for each and every meeting. Districts do have a right to pre-plan a meeting so long as they are not predetermining any decisions. These can be especially a good opportunity at pre-meetings to share information about present levels and a student's current progress, which can then be a launching point to identify potential problems that should be raised at the meeting or that may be raised by the parent, and brainstorming possible solutions for then discussion at the meeting. Creating an agenda is also an excellent way to help the team keep on track. This may be something that seems, simple, and everyone, you might presume that everyone may be on the same page in terms of what needs to be discussed, and that the IEP itself can just take you through what needs to be discussed. But actually taking the time to create an agenda can really help the team keep on track and help move the meeting along, and really help the parent as well as team members know what to expect, anticipate when certain issues are going to be discussed, and know that they will be discussed, so that they can, help perhaps ease certain anxieties or concerns about when certain things may be discussed and help move things along. Teams also can, and it's often encouraged, to make draft goals, accommodations, and behavior intervention plan if appropriate, to make it so that you can have those things ready and prepared in draft form for discussion at the meeting. Just being sure to make clear to the parent that they are just drafts, just recommendations, and that they're there for discussion with the parent. You can also give those draft goals to the parent ahead of time, which can allow the parent to better engage in discussion with the team if they have an opportunity to view those in advance. Again, wanting to make sure that you write draft on top of on the papers, and when you're giving them to the parent, making it clear to them that that's just what they are. And then when you're at the meeting, making sure that you are showing that you really are listening to any parent concerns about any of the draft goals that are there, and making any adjustments as needed.
Amy, this is somewhere I jump in. I do want to let people know there is some guidance from the U.S. Department of Education that recommends against draft goals. That is, as Amy said, that's not our recommendation, but I've had that thrown at me before by Parents Council that, look, you predetermined so much you had these draft goals. I don't want to turn every IEP meeting into a, game of poker where you're like thinking about what you can, like you're selling used cars or something, and what can I give and what can I take. But one thing to think about is you really do want to change something about the draft from the draft you send to the final IEP. So if you're proposing, you need to have some room to move in what you're proposing. So it can't be your last best offer, so to speak, in the draft IEP goals. You have to have given yourself something to give on in that draft document if it's going to be that kind of meeting especially. So just think about that. If the draft ends up being the final with no movement, that you're setting yourself up for a predetermination argument, and there is support that is evidence of predetermination. So just be aware of that.
Absolutely. And so when you are making those changes at the meeting, it's really important to not only obviously consider where to make those changes, but also to note, particularly in the additional notes, that those changes have been made. And also, while you may be doing draft goals, it's a best practice to avoid making, draft placement decisions, draft eligibility determinations. Those are decisions that should be made at the IEP table and wouldn't be appropriate to give in draft form to the parent.
All right, it's also critical that you have the right people at your meeting, and this is probably something that is pretty basic and everybody is aware of. You know your people who are required by IDEA to be at your IEP meeting, but it's important just to kind of think through what you think the meeting is going to look like and who are really your critical people. Always your parents are number one, and we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of parent participation in a few slides. The student, I think, is often left out, but I think we should think more about when it would be useful to have the student at that IEP meeting. Certainly when we're talking about transition planning, it's critical to have the student there and have that student's input on what their goals are and how they want to get there. But even in other meetings, when you're looking at a transition to high school, if you're looking at just any kind of opportunity to get that student involved, it can help with student buy-in into the IEP process. It can also help the parent be on better behavior if the student is there and stay really focused on the student and why you're at that meeting and how do we move forward. So think really carefully about whether it would be helpful to have the student at part or all of the IEP meeting. You guys are aware you always need a regular education teacher if the student is participating in general education. You need a special education teacher, your LEA rep. If you are interpreting evaluation results, if it's an eligibility meeting, you need somebody who's qualified to do that. We do recommend having your related services people at the meeting. And then anybody else who has particular knowledge about the student or the programming. And so that's really where you want to think about, do you know that reading methodology is going to be an issue at this meeting? If it is, then let's make sure we have our reading specialist there, or the reading teacher at least, who can really speak knowledgeably to that issue. Or if behavior is an issue at this meeting, do we have a behavior specialist, the social worker, a BCBA, somebody who really has specialized knowledge in that area that can speak to that and provide the team some guidance and make sure you're able to move forward on that issue. One other thing to note is that if your attorney is coming to the meeting, you do want to put the attorney on that invite list so that the parent has advance notice that the attorney is coming. You don't need to list the parent's attorney or the parent's advocate because it's the parent who's inviting that person. So they're obviously welcome at the meeting, but you don't need to list them on the paper invite. So having those people there is really critical.
Great. Thank you, Kendra. With that, our next of the top 10 tips is to be truthful at the meeting. As a third party to a lot of teams, we come into a situation when the parents secured an attorney often, and a lot of times, if time allows, I'll meet with the team a few minutes before the meeting just to get their temperature and understand what it is that they're recommending and advocating for the student. Often I'll get great descriptions from team members without the parents there when they're not as sometimes they're even nervous to meet me, but when they're not as nervous, they give a really clear explanation of here's the concern and here's what I'd like to do to address it. And then the meeting starts, and some parents have the effect on teams of everyone withdraws. No one wants to speak up. No one gives that clear information about what the issue is. And sometimes I think to myself, if I were this parent, I wouldn't really understand what this team was trying to tell me either. And so a lot of times I see that as my job then to ask questions, basically just to solicit the same information they told me maybe 30 minutes before. Assuming you have meetings without attorney participation, that's really you as an administrator's role, is to make sure to get that good information out of your team so that the parents have it at the meeting. An example of this would be, so I had a case recently where one team member described, so that we, said, oh, we have some behavior concerns, but we're managing it. But there are some issues, so we should probably do something about that. Then another team member, I said, well, what does that look like in the classroom? Well, the student was hitting, kicking, had urinated on the teacher, would strip down naked, and I'm like, whoa, okay, totally different situation. So sometimes I think that parents get the version of the problem, oh, some behavior concerns that we can manage, without getting the just observational information of what it looks like and what's going on, so that they can get on board then with how do we solve that problem, because that sounds like a big problem. So that's why we just stress being truthful at the meeting or before the meeting, so the parents really can understand why it is you're recommending what you're recommending. With that.
So then our next tip is really to make sure that you are ensuring, truly genuine parent participation at the meetings. Really make sure that parents feel listened to. One way to potentially consider doing this is by, team members who aren't typing notes in the IEP. Well, even though nowadays everyone has their computers at a lot of meetings now, really try to avoid, looking at them, having them open if possible, or having phones out, but really making eye contact with the parents, with others at the meeting, to show that there really is both that genuine listening as well as trying to elicit that participation. Watch body language of the parent as well. Ask a parent, throughout the meeting if there are questions, not just at the section where their parent concerns are specifically addressed, but perhaps, following each person's report. And if it appears that the parent is expressing, concern or confusion, even if the parent isn't saying that, reach out to the parent to make sure that to see if they have any questions. And you can ask, more pointed questions to elicit conversation rather than just saying, do you have any questions? Also ask more specific questions. Is this consistent with what you are seeing at home? Has the student shared this with you at home? Are the daily communications methods working for you, if that's something that you're discussing? Or asking if there's anything that they would like to add when you're talking about certain present levels. And where a parent does have a question, really try to answer it as directly as possible with answers specific to the child. If a parent requests something that team members do not think is reasonable or agreeable, discuss it and have a good discussion about what that parent is requesting. Make sure that you explain why you think that it may or may not work for this student. And ultimately, you don't have to agree, but discuss and explain the point of view of the team members as to why they disagree or don't agree with what the parent is requesting. Discuss alternatives that might be possible as well. And if, wherever possible, ground your responses in data. So for example, if you're discussing goals, ground discussion in the data of the present levels and why you think the proposed goal would or would not be appropriate for the student based on his current present levels and what the data shows. While you can and should attempt to reach compromise with a parent, you don't have to agree to unreasonable demands. And in those instances, just note the parent's request in the additional notes, explain why it was rejected by the team if it is, and then proceed on. And you can handle that the same way, if parent becomes argumentative with regard to a certain point after a fruitful discussion. Simply note the parent's perspective, let them know that you will be noting it in the notes, and that you'll be noting the discussion that you had, that you'll make it clear to the parent that her position will be noted in the minutes, and explain that the team disagrees, that her disagreement will be noted in the minutes, and then just move on. Jennifer and Kendra, do you have any other tips on how to handle parents who may become more argumentative or confrontational at meetings?
Yeah, I think sort of to the point before of what the administrator or what the attorney's role is at a meeting, if a parent becomes escalated and they're yelling, they're finger shaking, they're upset, you can do several things. One is to deflect if it's the teacher and the parent that are engaged, or a service provider and the parent. That's the time for the administrator, or if there's attorneys to step in and take over that conversation. You need to preserve some ability of the teacher to work with the family, and so it really is a bad cop, good cop situation where the bad cop of the administrator or the attorney needs to step in and be the one to engage on that dispute. You can take a break. So, whether being straightforward and say, you seem escalated, I think we need to take a break, and we will take 5 minutes and then we'll reconvene and actually leave the room, or show the parent to a room where they can get some water or coffee or something like that. Or sometimes being that direct is not helpful, and I'm a little more passive-aggressive about it and say, I need a comfort or bathroom break, so can we just, we're going to take a 5 minutes, and that's fine too. That usually works well. You can, at times, if you have to, end the meeting if people are being extremely inappropriate. Educators should not be yelled at. They should not be cursed at. They should not be threatened. And some of that kind of behavior, there's no way to proceed other than ending the meeting. Sometimes I've offered that if you can't participate respectfully, we're going to have you participate by phone, and we're going to have to reschedule. You unfortunately get into all kinds of procedural issues at times when you're backed up against a timeline. Okay, now how do we finish this IEP, or do certain reconvening within the time that you have under the deadlines can be challenging. So, all of that, sometimes it's less painful to proceed and just say, okay, well, I think we're going to make a decision on this, this, and this, move it along in the meeting and not reconvene is often preferable. Kendra, anything else you can think of?
Yeah, those are really good tips, and I think having your agenda and trying to kind of redirect back towards the agenda can be helpful. And giving those individualized answers, I think, can help avoid some of the escalation. Sometimes parents, I think, get escalated if they say, I think my student needs 3 hours of social work every week. And the social worker looks at the parent like they're crazy and says, well, I can't give 3 hours of social work. You've set up an immediate conflict. If the parent says, I think my student needs an iPad at home, and your immediate response is, we don't do that, you're setting up a conflict. And so if the response instead is, why do you think your student needs that? And how can we address that need? And what is that going to look like? And asking some questions and trying to problem solve, sometimes you can avoid the escalation. Sometimes you have parents where it's unavoidable, but you want to do everything you can to try and maintain that civil and respectful meeting that you start out with. Okay, the next thing is to ensure you're complying with Endrew F. And so everybody is aware of the fairly recent Supreme Court case, Endrew F., which sort of slightly revises our FAPE standard. So our new standard is that the IEP is reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress that's appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. And the way I like to think about that is the IEP team at the meeting is really figuring out what is appropriate progress in light of the child's circumstances and writing that into the goals, right? How much progress do we think the student can make between now and a year from now? And those are going to be your annual goals. So be thinking about that standard when you're writing your goals and trying to make sure that they are ambitious but also realistic. There's no per se violation that, if you don't meet the goal, then that's automatically a denial of FAPE. There's no guarantee. It's a reasonably calculated IEP, so it's your best guess about how much the student can do in the next year, and you just want to kind of be balanced in how ambitious you're being versus how realistic you're being with the levels you set on those goals. The other important thing is the present levels to begin with, and then the progress report, because those are really going to demonstrate, let's say the student doesn't meet a particular goal, how close did they get? How much progress did they make over the course of the year? You know, if we set a goal for a student to reach 80% on, let's say, a multiplication goal, and they started out at 70% and they ended at 75%, that wasn't very ambitious and they didn't make a lot of growth. But if we had that same multiplication goal, trying to hit 80%, and it was a brand new skill for that student, they were starting at 0. Now, if they make it up to 75%, well, that was a lot of growth, right? This is a brand new skill, and the student almost made it to the goal that you set. And so having that present level that addresses the exact same skill as the goal itself sets that baseline that you can measure progress from. And then having really detailed data-driven progress reports lets the parent know, and if we have to get to a hearing, lets the hearing officer know how much progress that student made. So really having well-drafted goals that are looking at discrete observable behavior and also specify the circumstances for performance and the level of mastery is critical. You want to make sure if you hand that IEP to a stranger and they tried to implement it with the student, they would know what that goal was supposed to look like. You know, is it in the speech one-on-one setting, or is it in the general ed classroom? Is it with 3 prompts, or is it independent? You know, what are those circumstances that you're looking for the student to perform, and making sure all of those are laid out? Because if they're not, you know, we find it a year later, the team might be saying, look, the student can do it, and the parent is saying, well, I tried it at home, and he can't do it at all. You know, he won't do it, he has no idea what's going on. And maybe the teacher is really looking at it as, well, with me sitting next to him giving XYZ prompts, the student can, but if that's not spelled out in the goal, you know, your expectations aren't going to align and you're going to end up with conflict. And so having those really clear goals, present levels, and progress reports will help keep all of that aligned.
Great. Our next tip is consider methodology. This is probably an area, if I tallied up my cases right now, where I have the most, how I would describe most of the disputes that I'm in due process with. It would be either methodology or placement, and methodology is catching up to placement, I would say. There are I would say 2 different areas. For autism, there's been a lot of longstanding litigation about ABA as a methodology for students with autism. But the other area that we're seeing a lot of advocacy from parents' attorneys is around reading, and what methodology you're using as a reading intervention. The cases, while this gets a little bit nuanced, because while the IEP doesn't have to state methodology, if parent brings up methodology, or if methodology is a necessary discussion for the student to make any progress in the area, then it really does anymore need to be discussed and addressed. And there are more and more, you know, popular articles that our parents are accessing, newspaper articles that say you must do a multisensory phonics-based research program, an Orton-Gillingham type intervention for students to make progress with some of the reading deficits that you commonly see. If you don't use one of those methodologies and you just say special education instruction, we're unfortunately seeing school districts lose those cases. So while it's expensive and maybe questionably effective, getting some methodology, you can still pick. So if the dispute is we have Wilson and parent wants Linda Mood Bell, that you'll win. If the dispute is parent wants Linda Mood Bell and we say we use, our teacher has a special education degree and learned about reading instruction in college and is really good at helping kids learn to read, unfortunately we lose that case anymore. Really, you do need some programmatic intervention when you get to that level of dispute over reading. With that,
Right. So we've talked a lot this morning already about, different ways to potentially problem solve and get over the hump with certain disputes with parents. But, as you're thinking through potential solutions, it might be that what a parent is requesting or what the team is proposing is not fully agreed upon. And in such situations, try to consider creative solutions that might get you closer to an agreement, even if it looks like that agreement might not be able to be reached at the meeting itself. So for example, one solution may be to gather more information, especially where the team feels it may not have enough information to grant the particular request that the parent is making, or where more data may help the parent feel more comfortable with the team's decision, or at least may help support the team's decision. So one way to problem solve may be in the case of a proposed change in placement, where the parent is not yet in agreement, or where a parent wants a change in placement and the school's not yet in agreement. A solution could be to collect more data before considering a change in placement and then meet again in 2 or 3 months to review that. Or another option could be to invite parents to observe, recognizing that the setting and how the student may be performing may be different when the parents are there, but that's another possible solution that could be offered in the interim between meetings. You could also consider a trial period in new classes or placement if that's something that everyone felt comfortable doing, with the option then again to meet again soon to review the student's progress in that placement. Another way to get over an impasse is sometimes to also offer to do an independent evaluation, such as a psychological evaluation, which can allow an independent party to weigh in, give a neutral perspective, which can often then provide some further insight. Ultimately, you can be thinking ahead long term of where you really want the student to be at the end of the year, middle school and high school, and how the different things that you're, addressing and are at potentially an impasse for, what's really going to help get the student to be where you want them to be.
I think we're going to do a lightning round for our last 3 of the tips and then wrap it up. So maybe Kendra?
Yeah. Okay, so making decisions is obviously critical. Oftentimes we get to these disputes and we go back and forth. Should we do this? Should we do that? We want to make sure at the end of the meeting it's really clear where the team ended up. We don't want there to be any confusion about whether we decided on option A or option B. So remember, parent consent is required for evaluations and reevaluations and initial placement into special education. Other than that, you as the LEA representative is going to determine what's the consensus of the team and make that decision. Even if the parent doesn't agree, we need to come to the decision that we think will provide the student safe and document it. If the parent disagrees, they always have the option to ask for mediation or to file a due process complaint. We like to tell people practice saying no in a polite but informed and firm way so that, this is our decision and we're going to move on.
Take meaningful notes. I think that Amy covered this in some of her slide, and this is just basically showing your work so that when 2 years pass and we're at a hearing and no one can really remember the specific meeting, we have some record that's credible as far as what actually happened, how the parents' concerns were addressed, and what the decisions were made.
Finally, respond to red flags. So certainly if you get a request for records from a parent's attorney, that's a red flag that they have, hired someone to because there's a dispute. Even if they submit a records request on their own, that's often going to be a sign that they may have an advocate or attorney that they are considering bringing on board. So, not only do you need to obviously address those requests, but reach out to the parent. Try to get ahead of, finding out what the concern is if you don't already know it. You obviously will need to specifically respond to any requests for an independent educational evaluation, or if the parent has said that they are changing schools or the programs. In addition, keep in mind to discipline issues. If you see a student really experiencing significant discipline issues, that's a time to also making sure that you're reaching out to the parent, perhaps convene an IEP meeting to get ahead of certain issues.
Great. With that, we are out of time. We do want to invite everyone who's on the podcast, if you'll be down in Springfield on later this week for IAASE, please join us for a drinks and dessert reception late on Thursday night. Our invitation should have been circulated. If you haven't received it, please reach out to one of us. We can get you registered. If you even just see us, we'd just be pleased if you come, whether or not you register, frankly. So with that, also our next webinar will be, I'll turn it over to Amy.
Our next webinar will be on March 12th at 10 a.m., so please join us for that, where we will be discussing the ESSA Arts Assessment Indicator Report to ISB. So that will be an exciting webinar that we are looking forward to.
Thank you. Morgan, are we off?